James Biddle. Welcome back to Feedback. And welcome back to Future Doctor TV show. And we're going to do a series of topics relevant to your health and looking at them from an integrative medicine perspective. So we're going to combine the best of both conventional medicine and alternative medicine, and we're going to use that to educate you about your health topics that are of most concern to you. Tonight we're going to talk about osteoporosis. According to the World Health Organization, osteoporosis globally is the second biggest health problem after cardiovascular disease. It leads to 1.5 million fractures per year just in the United States. And if you're a woman in the age range of 30 to 40, then by the time you live your life out, you have a 50% chance, a 1 in 2 chance of getting a fracture due to osteoporosis at some point in your life. So that's a huge odds. And I see osteoporosis as one of the leading causes why people go into a nursing home from hip fractures. They lose their independence, second only to dementia. In order to deal with osteoporosis, first we have to learn a little bit about bone structure. Here's a picture of a bone. Around the edge you have the thicker bone, and in the middle you have the thinner bone, or the trabecular bone. It's really the thicker bone around the edge that we're talking about that loses its stability. That's really what's holding everything together. That's the cement that's holding the bone strength. There's two parts to bone formation and resorption. There's osteoblasts, which are forming bone, and then there's osteoclasts, which are breaking down bone. And here we have a picture of an osteoclast, and what this is basically a cell that's lying over a piece of the bone inside the bone structure, and it's releasing enzymes down here. This single cell is making kind of a little tent over a piece of the bone. It's releasing enzymes here, and it's basically eating away some of the bone. And our bone turns over constantly. Everybody has bone turnover all the time. But your rebuilding, or the blast formation of your bone, should be at least as strong as your breaking down, or the clast destruction of your bone. And when that gets out of balance, that's when you get thinning of the bone over time. I mentioned in my nutrition lecture that one of the classic causes of thinning of the bone is actually not enough protein in the diet. People who have chronic protein deficiency can get thinning of the bones because your body will scavenge the bones for that protein, just like it scavenges the muscles. So this is what we're really after, is how do you slow down the osteoclasts and how do you speed up the osteoblasts so that you're building bone rather than losing bone density all the time. Now, it's important to recognize that treating osteoporosis is really very challenging. Once you have thin bones, it's a lot of work to rebuild those. It's a heck of a lot easier if you start early in life and don't lose that bone density. Women start losing bone density as early as 25 years of age. So, biologically, we basically hit our peak in our hormones and anabolic or growing phase at about 25. And then from then on, it's starting to, you kind of break even for a period of time, from years to decades, depending on how well you live. And then things start to decline unless you're really working hard not to let them decline. And this is true for bone density too, as well as muscle mass and brain function, things like that. So early identification of accelerated bone loss is critical, and we're going to go over some tests that you can do earlier in life rather than waiting for later in life to do the actual bone density measurement. And that can give people a clue as to who's at greater risk and needs to pay more attention to their bone health now. So how do we measure bone loss and risk for osteoporosis? Well, the standard test is an X-ray test called a bone mineral density, or a BMD. That's usually called a DEXA, is the medical name for it. And that basically tells us the resistance the bone has to X-rays passing through it, and that tells us the density of the bone, because the more calcium you have in the bone, then the more resistance there is to the X-rays, the more scattering there is of the X-rays. That's a very good test. The major drawbacks to it, it's moderately expensive, a couple $100. It exposes you to some radiation, so that's always a concern. To have to redo that too often is not something you really want to do. There's other ways to also check for risk for osteoporosis, and one of my favorite is the urinary bone resorption assay. The bone resorption assay doesn't tell you where you are, but it tells us where you're headed. It tells you the slope of the curve. With everything you're doing right now, are you building bone or losing bone? And then the third test we have is actually looking at the genetics of your own body and seeing whether you inherited genes that are dysfunctional, that are putting you at risk for increased bone loss. And the reason that's so powerful is that it lets us specifically direct the therapy towards your own body rather than choosing a general therapy, shotgunning like you would everybody. So what we look at is the biochemical markers. And the biochemical markers tell you the bone turnover. It tells you this balance between the osteoblasts building the bone and the osteoclasts breaking down the bone. Are we striking a good balance there? It gives you immediate information on that, and it can predict future losses as long as everything's in steady state. It's very convenient. It's just a take-home first morning urine test, and it's relatively inexpensive. I think they're less than $100 to do this test. So this tells you about the bone turnover rate, and it indicates the need for preventative and early treatment strategies to help avoid developing osteoporosis and disabling fractures. And it also lets us evaluate the effectiveness of treatment in real time. In a matter of just a couple months, we can go back and retest after we've added another therapy and say, okay, now do we have it right? If we still don't have it right, we can go back again, measure it very cheaply, no danger, no x-ray exposure. So you can do this perhaps 4 times in a single year until you get it right, until you figure out what's going to help this particular patient rebuild their bone density. So next, if we're getting somebody, and I only do this test a couple times a year because I find I can usually get good results on people, but if we're trying almost everything we know of and we're not getting good results, or if somebody has a very strong family history of osteoporosis, we can then do genetic testing on them. And genetic testing will help us give a very focused approach to treatment of their bone density. Here's a sample report of doing this genetics. In this particular report, the negative or green means that your gene for that particular trait is normal, and the big red positive means that you got an abnormal gene. Since you get one gene from your mother and one gene from your father, you have 2 chances. So you can have both normal, you can have both abnormal, you can have one of each, a good gene and a bad gene. So it's obviously when you have the 2 red ones that you're probably going to get into more trouble. And what we're looking at in this is 5 different genes. And these are called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms. And what the lab chooses to measure is a polymorphism, or a variability in the population that occurs in at least 1% of the population. They don't want to go looking at SNPs that occur in just 1/10 of the population, because you're not getting good enough yield. You're going to spend a lot of money for not finding any results. And they're also looking at things you can actually do something about. So, I mean, you could have SNPs that are very common, but if there's nothing you can do about it, then there's really no use measuring it.